Bikes, trikes and scooters. Welcome to another motorcycling video. Just riding around town and no particular purpose. I'm going to the place where I'm going to start my morning run, and in this video I'm just going to talk about those three things: bikes, trikes and scooters. There's a fair bit of rivalry, some might even say snobbery, in the motorcycle world. Are you, for example, a imperial measure or a metric measure? Do you measure your motorcycle's capacity or displacement in terms of cc's or cubic inches? It doesn't make any difference really, but it does delineate two groups of people. The metrics being most of the world, and the imperial measure, or the cubic inches, being Americans, Harleys and Indian in particular. And your bike can be a 1600 or a 1700 or 104 cubic inches. It doesn't make any difference to the performance or anything like that, but it's just a delineation. There's the delineation between those who love the European brands, for example, Ducati and BMW, and those who love American brands. There is the rivalry between the four Japanese manufacturers, that is Honda, Yamaha, Suzuki and Kawasaki. There are those that look down their nose at the people who ride scooters. And then, God help us, there's the trike community, the three-wheelers. Does your trike have one wheel at the front or two wheels at the front? So all of these sorts of rivalries exist in motorcycling. Then there's the sports bikes and the cruisers and the tourers and the various classes within those that everybody swears by their brand or their model or their bike is the best bike ever, and I'm sure they all are. I've owned and ridden a few bikes, and I'm going to talk about those in this video and give you the benefit of my insight into them. I'm not necessarily going to say one's better than the other. I'm just going to talk about each of them and tell you a little bit about the ones that I've owned and why I've owned them and choices that I've made. So I first got involved in motorcycling and first started motorcycling when I was about 17, and I had a Russian motorcycle called a Voshkod. It was pretty ugly, pretty unreliable and pretty uncomfortable, but I didn't ride it very far. I used to just ride it to school, which is about 2 k's from where I lived. I inherited it from my brother. I think it was a 250. It was certainly air-cooled, and as I say, not very reliable. My dad seemed to spend more time trying to make it work than we did actually riding it. A little later on I had a Honda CB 250, an orange one, and if I recall, that was a very comfortable and reliable bike, and Honda have always made good bikes. That's one thing you can say about them. They've always made good, strong, reliable bikes, and I had that bike for about a year or so, and then I didn't motorcycle. I didn't have any involvement in motorcycling for about 25 years. Marriages and families, and you think about one car for the children, and then when there's a few more children and jobs in different directions, 2 cars and things like that. The motorcycling is a luxury rather than a necessity. So I kept my motorcycle license because it was just part of my car license, but I didn't motorcycle for about 25 years. And then I decided at one stage I wanted to get back into motorcycling, and I wanted to start doing it again. So I bought a Honda 600, which I think I might have been the third or fourth owner for it, and I don't think it had been very well looked after, and it seemed to spend more time in the shop than it did underneath me riding it. And I didn't keep that for very long. I didn't pay much for it, and whilst I enjoyed riding it, it was not a very good bike. I think it hadn't been looked after very well, and I let it go after a while. But so then I seriously got back into motorcycling. I bought a Yamaha XV1100. Now the XV1100 came in 3 designations. I think there was the Sports, the Classic and the American. They're essentially the same bike, the difference being stylistic, and the American had a heavily valenced front mudguard, whereas one of the others had a spoke wheel at the front, and I can't remember the differences, but essentially it was an 1100 cruiser, air-cooled, which meant that it was a little bit noisier than some of the other bikes. It had a really good tall screen that kept the wind off me. It had leg shields. It had a couple of bags, soft bags that sat over the back of it, and it was a very comfortable bike to ride. I rode it back and forth to my work on a 200 kilometre a day commute for about 5 years. When I bought it, it had about 14,000 kilometres on it, and I think when I sold it, it had about 165,000 kilometres on it. And I only ever had one problem with that bike, and that is when I put E10 fuel in it once, just because it seemed to be what you're supposed to do, try E10 fuel in your car or your bike or whatever. And I think the seals in the fuel pump might have been rubber, and the ethanol might have affected the rubber seals, and so I had to get a new fuel pump. Other than that, I never had any problems with it. It rode comfortably. It was reliable. It was a shaft drive, so I never had any issues with belts or chains or anything like that. It started every time. It was good two-up. I had myself and my son on the back a few times. The rider seat was really comfortable. I'm not so sure about the passenger seat. It seemed like more like a small pad than a seat. But I've never been on the back of any motorcycle, so I can't really tell you a lot about the comfort factor from the back. But I kept it for about 5 years and then looked at it and thought, well, it's getting a few Ks on the clock and maybe things could start going wrong with it. And a few other things happened at the same time, and I decided to upgrade to a new bike rather than a second-hand one. And I love cruisers. I really like the lines and the style and the design of cruisers. And I like the fact that they're fairly low to the ground. The seat height is quite low, so when you sit on the bike, you sit low to the ground and your feet are flat on the ground. The Yamaha had footboards for the rider and footboards for the pillion rather than just pegs, which I found much more comfortable than just pegs. And I really like the style and design of cruisers, and I find them very comfortable. So I then decided I would get a Kawasaki Vulcan Voyager 1700. It was also modelled on some Harley Davidson. I can't remember which one, because an alphabet of letters after the name of the Harley Davidson model. But I had that Kawasaki. I rode it for the last 2 years of my working life. Put about 70,000 kilometres on it over that 2-year period. And then I kept it for another 9 years in my retirement. And by the time I let that go, I had about 100,000 kilometres on it. In that time, the only issue I ever had with it was a leaking fork seal. And that happened twice. The second time I had to get the actual fork itself, or the leg of the fork, replaced, the outer housing, I guess, because it had become scored, which is why the seal was leaking in the first place. I never had any other mechanical issues with it. I had it serviced all the time. It started every time. It was a belt drive, and people were worried about how long belts would last. Well, as I say, when I let the bike go, it had 100,000 kilometres on it, and I hadn't changed the belt. It had a few more bells and whistles, and it was liquid cooled, as opposed to, as I said, air cooled with the Yamaha. It had cruise control. It had a really tall screen, which was good for keeping the wind off. You had leg shields which were open. You could open. They had sort of louvers on them, so you could open them in the summertime and let some airflow around your legs, but close them in winter time to keep the wind off your legs. As I said, cruise control. It had a solid built-in top case and 2 side cases. So it had plenty of luggage and storage, and a couple of little cubby holes in the dash. It had an audio system with AM and FM radio, and through a connection to a 3.5mm earphone type jack, you could plug your MP3 player into, back in the days when people had MP3 players like iPods, plug it into the sound system and play your music through the sound system. It also had a 12 volt socket, so I suppose if I'd have known about it at the time, I probably could have got a Bluetooth, one of those Bluetooth FM transmitters, and connected my phone. But I didn't want to do that. When I'm on my bike, I don't want to be bothered with my phone. I want to be away from my phone. I don't want to have to answer messages or answer phone calls or things like that. But I could have, connected a Bluetooth transmitter of some sort and then used a USB stick or an TF card or something with music on it to play music. But I had an MP3 player, a bit like an iPod, but not an iPod. And it had plenty of music on it, so I could play music through that, or I could just listen to the radio. I found that bike very comfortable, and I rode it, as I said, for about 70,000 kilometres over the time that I was working. I rode it to work and back every day. It was a 6-speed as opposed to the Yamaha, which was a 5-speed. Now, you wouldn't think that would make a lot of difference, but the 6-speed was an overdrive, so when you're on the highway, you really got into the 6th gear, and it meant that you would have much better fuel consumption. The engine wasn't working quite so hard to take you where you were going. And I think on days when I was out on the highways a lot, I could, with the cruise control set at 100, mostly 100 on the Spyder, so maybe around 95, I could probably get something like 24 kilometres per litre, so that would be something like 4 and a bit litres per 100 kilometres out of a 1700 cc motorcycle. The bike itself, when fully laden and wet with all fuels and fluids and so on, was about 385 kilos, and then add on my 80 kilos at the time, so that's about 460 kilos. It's quite a solid, heavy bike, but of course, as with any bike, you don't really notice the weight when you're riding around, when you're on the highway. When you do notice is when you're slowing down and when you are trying to negotiate roundabouts and give way signs and all that sort of stuff. And that was part of my daily routine, to get out of the town where I live, and then when I got close to where I worked, coming into another semi or sort of urban environment with suburbs and roundabouts and give way signs and school crossings and all that sort of stuff. And so it was quite, I wouldn't say difficult at first, but it was certainly a challenge to be able to manoeuvre this thing. I think the Yamaha XV1100 was probably about 250 kilos. And as I said, this thing was close to 400 kilos fully laden without me on it. So there's another 150 kilos of weight there. The Yamaha was a little lower to the ground and obviously much lighter, and therefore a bit easier to manoeuvre. So the thing about the Kawasaki was, as I say, that manoeuvrability thing when you were in urban areas, so speed limits around 50 kilometres an hour and so on. That's when you started to notice the weight of a heavy bike. So I got to a point when I'd been retired about 9 years, that I started thinking this Kawasaki, which I really love riding and I thoroughly enjoy it, and I haven't had any mechanical issues other than the fork issue that I mentioned, is getting to be a bit heavy. I'm starting to find it a bit difficult to pull it up off the stand, and as I say, manoeuvring it around in the city or in the urban environment so I could get out on the highway and open it up to 100 and just sit back and let it go, was getting to be more difficult and not as much pleasure as I had originally got out of it. And at the time, one of my sons, he also had a Kawasaki. I think it was must have been the Vulcan 1600, not the Voyager, but the Vulcan 1600. And he was involved in an accident where someone in a landscaper in a truck, not looking where they were going in Melbourne, tried to make one of those stupid hook turns or something like that they make in Victoria, and collected him, and the bike was damaged. He was fortunately not injured in that accident in any way, but the bike went down and was damaged. And because they'd stopped making that particular model a few years ago, it was hard to get parts for it and so on. And after a bit of back and forth between himself and the landscape company's insurance company, they decided to write the bike off. So I made an arrangement with him that I would sell him the Kawasaki Voyager for the insurance money, and I would put more money towards it, and I would buy myself a Spyder. And so I'll come to the Trikes and the scooters in the next edition of this video, but at the end of this video you'll see the pictures of the bikes that I've owned. You'll see the Voshkod, the Honda CB250, the Yamaha XV1100, the Kawasaki Vulcan Voyager. You will also see a couple of scooters, a Piaggio MP3 400, which I'll talk about in the next video, the Suzuki Bergman 650 AN Executive scooter, which I'll talk about in the next video, and the Can-Am Spyder, which I'm riding now, but I will talk about more in the next video. So I'm giving you a bit of a taste of the bikes, trikes and scooters in this video, but there's a second one where I will give you a little bit more of a taste. So thank you for watching. If you have some comment about any of the things I've said so far, please feel free to leave it in the comment section, and when I become aware of it, I will respond in the usual way. Thanks for watching, and I'll catch you in the next video.